This morning, before I proceed with the sermon, I want to say something to you about the book of Isaiah, out of which our scriptures were read this morning. First, I would like for you to know that in Isaiah, we find three voices named Isaiah who speak to three very different historical times. The first Isaiah's voice is the one we heard during Advent, the one who promised that unto us a son was born, unto us a child was given, the child that would be named Immanuel, God with us. The voice of that Isaiah spoke early before calamity struck Judah. The voice of the second Isaiah comes while Judah and the best and brightest of Jerusalem and Judah have been taken off into captivity in Babylon. That is the voice we heard this morning in chapter 40. The voice of the third Isaiah is found in the last portion of the book of Isaiah, and that voice speaks to the people who have returned to their devastated land after Cyrus, the king of Persia, tells them to go home. So perhaps that knowledge of Isaiah will help you hear chapter 40, the portions that were read to you this morning, with a little more clarity and understanding. It had been a long, long night for God's chosen people. They mourned, they despaired, they tottered between belief and doubt. Some held on to the old traditions of their faith. Others abandoned them. Their memories were seared with evidence of images of dead and bloated bodies of men, women, and children littering the streets of Jerusalem. The walls of God's holy city being pulled to the ground and flames dancing through God's holy temple. They could not forget being rounded up like cattle, the best and the brightest of Jerusalem and Judea, and herded like animals off to captivity in Babylon. When they arrived in Babylon, they sat down by her rivers, and their captors taunted them, saying, "Sing, sing for us songs of Zion." But they hung their harps in the trees, and they did not sing. For who can sing of Zion in a strange land? They lamented. In Babylon, they wondered what had happened to their God, Yahweh. He had not protected them from their enemies. His steadfast love had become vengeful wrath, bent on destroying them. His promised land had become a wasteland, trampled and burned by Nebuchadnezzar's armies. The holy city was now a haunt for jackals, the temple nothing more than smoldering ruins. Many of them thought their mourning and their weeping would never end. Their questions about Yahweh never silenced. Where was Yahweh, they wondered? Was he asleep while the armies of Babylon besieged Jerusalem, starved its citizens to death, scaled its walls, and slaughtered the innocent? Was he, the creator of the universe, powerless to save them from the armies of Babylon? They wailed and prayed and wailed some more, voicing their lament, shaking their fist at the heavens, demanding that Yahweh explain his gross negligence. Why had Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, let something so terrible befall them, his children? That's the way some folks handled Babylon. But there were others who thought it best to forget the past. And they took Jeremiah's advice. Yes, they were strangers in a strange land, and they always would be. But at least there were opportunities in Babylon. In the midst of Babylon's wealth, they found their hope. They would simply forget Jerusalem, devastated Judah. They would forget the past. And so in Babylon, in this strange land, they would build houses, they would plant vineyards, they would give their sons and daughters in marriage, they would begin to rebuild and restore their lives. In Babylon, they would be free to forget Yahweh and His promises. In Babylon, they would erase from their memories any images of the beauty of the temple, and they would accept their destiny forever to live in this strange land. For them, Yahweh was as good as dead, slain by the more powerful gods of the Babylonians. So, this morning, let us realize it is to these people that Isaiah is speaking. People who are still mourning and weeping and lamenting over the loss of the past. Some folks who've chosen to forget it, to make their way in a strange new world. And when Isaiah spoke his message, both of these groups heard it as foolishness. The people were possessed by deep skepticism. Isaiah spoke and they responded. Our suffering has ended, you say? The word of God endures forever? You must be kidding. He is like a shepherd gathering us up in His arms, carrying us close to His heart. Come on, look where we are in Babylon. The glory of the Lord will be revealed. Wake up, man. Can't you see that God abandoned us long ago? Shut up. Forget it. We've moved on. Yahweh has been silent too long. There is no reason to return to the land of Judah. Jerusalem is a pile of stones. We don't want to get back there. No matter how straight that pathway is in the desert, no matter how many mountains God brings down, we just don't want to go. Perhaps this morning you are surprised that anyone would speak to God's prophet and thus to God in such a coarse and direct and honest manner. Perhaps you cannot identify with their courage to express themselves, acknowledging before God their despair, their shattered dreams, their honest doubts, their very real skepticism about whether God can do anything at all in the world. Yet the fact that the prophet Isaiah stands there reveals the genius of Israel's prophets. They are able to capture the spirit of the people and give it voice. And at the very same time, they are able to speak for God, expressing His passion. Prophets stand in the middle between present realities and the new things that God is going to do. Prophets like Isaiah see God's hands clearly upon human history, and they also see His hands shaping our personal destinies. From the prophet's perspective, from Isaiah's perspective, kings and queens come and go, nations rise and fall. Only Yahweh, the God of history, endures forever. The God who is above and beyond history endures forever. Isaiah, the prophet, stands in the middle between what is and what is to be. Isaiah sees clearly. He is not naive. He is not stupid. God's people are in captivity in Babylon, and they have been there for a long time. But what they cannot see, he can. Persia is on the rise. And one day very soon, the glory of Babylon is going to be gone, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, is going to be the ruler of the world. And more than that, if you can believe it, Cyrus is God's servant. And in a short time, God's servant Cyrus, king of Persia, will decree that all of God's children may go home. They may go back to their homeland, back to Judah, back to Jerusalem. And he will give money, silver and gold from the treasuries of Babylon so that they can go home and rebuild their lives and their promised land. That's what Isaiah sees. The very real present and what is about to be. As God's voice, Isaiah the prophet must confront the doubts, the fears, the skepticism, and the cynicism of God's people, who are either demanding that Yahweh be true to a faith that they have emptied of its meaning, or who have chosen to forget all about God. They have become enamored with the spirit of the times. Let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. Today, in our world, not only must we hear the prophet Isaiah, but we must become like the prophet Isaiah. All around today, there are people, and perhaps we find ourselves among them at different times every day, who look at the world with fear and trembling, and they despair. And they choose to hold God responsible for all the hunger and the disease, the hatred and the violence and the wars that they see and read about. They shake their fist at the heavens and they demand that God explain himself and come take care of this awful, dreadful mess. These folks weep and lament and despair. And they keep reaching back for a past that they think was much more glorious and much more powerful and much more wonderful in reference to God. But they have very selective memories, like the Hebrew children with Moses in the wilderness. When they became hungry, they remember the exotic foods that were on the tables in Egypt. But they had forgotten the sting of the whip as they were driven harder and harder to make more and more bricks without straw. And then there are others among us who simply pass off all the hatred, all the injustice, all the violence, all the wars they see and read about as being just the way they are. Things never change, they say. So, given that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, let us do the best we can and take care of our families and our homes and our children and our grandchildren. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. For the people of Isaiah's time and for our time, perhaps what we really need is a change of perspective. A change of perspective that is very old that Isaiah was trying to bring the people of his day back to. Perhaps you and I should take Isaiah's advice and consider for a moment, does God really need anyone to instruct him? Does God need anyone to enlighten him? Does God need anyone to teach him knowledge? Should we ponder for a while exactly who God consulted when he created the heavens and the earth? Surely by now we should realize that nations rise and fall. Kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers return to the dust just like us all. For you see, in the end, you can't tell the difference between the bones of the rich and the bones of the poor, the bones of the powerless and the bones of the powerful. Death and time has a way of making us all so very, very much the same. Sometimes we need a dose of reality as it comes to us from God in the voices of His prophets. We need to remember that He created and He is Creator. We need to remember that He fashioned us humans from the dust of the earth. And when we become infatuated with our significance, demanding that God give us answers, perhaps we should look simply into the night sky and let the vast expanse of the universe remind us of how truly small and insignificant we are and how little we know about what lies beyond the darkness. Perhaps if we look to the heaven, we would be reminded of God's transcendence. He is a spirit. He is beyond us. His ways are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our thoughts. Thank God Almighty. And perhaps we would see very clearly that our precious idols of possessions, power, and positions are just that, idols. But let us know, too, that God is with us, that God is Immanuel, and that God asks us, why? Why do you complain? Why do you insist on crying that I have abandoned you and that I have hidden myself from you? Why do you accuse me of gross negligence and not being concerned about you at all? Perhaps we should hear God say through His prophets, do you not realize I never stop my saving and redeeming work? I never stop seeking to heal and mend the lives that you mangle. I never stop trying to take care of those whom you leave hungry and thirsty and naked and imprisoned, those whom you forget. I never stop seeking to respond to the injustices that you accept by sending my peace workers into the world. I never stop trying to bring an end to the violence that you have turned your back on. I never stop sending voices into the world to encourage nations to see the promise of refusing to learn war anymore, of exchanging their weapons for farming and construction tools. When we read the newspapers and despair, when we turn off the televisions in disgust, when we've had all of our world that we can stomach, let's not forget that God does not grow weary or tired. God does not sleep. God is with us in the midst of all of this. And it is God who offers strength to those of us who are weary, seeking justice and peace in the world. It is God who increases, surprisingly to us, the power of the weak and the poor and the forgotten. Yes, living in our times may bring weariness that is inescapable. Yes, maybe living in our times, even the young will grow doubtful and skeptical. But for those of us who wait and hope on the Lord Himself will renew our strength. And when we wait upon Him for the renewal of our strength, sometimes we will soar like eagles, and nothing will resist us. Sometimes we will run and not grow weary. There will be no power that will crush our hopes and our dreams for God's kingdom to come on this earth and His will to be done here as in heaven. But there will be times, and the same Lord will be with us, that all we are able to do is put one foot in front of the other, to walk and not faint. But even then, we will not surrender the hope that only God can give. Several years ago on television, I enjoyed watching Bill Moyers, usually on Friday evenings. And one evening he was interviewing a woman by the name of Susan Neiman. She had written a book entitled Evil in Modern Thought. And through the course of that interview, she talked about a lot of the darkness that seemed to be filling the world in which we live. And toward the end of the interview, Bill Moyers asked her, Susan, do you have hope or you despair? She says it changes daily. It changes daily because, and it depends on how many people I perceive are out there holding a candle up against the darkness. It changes day by day, but it all depends on how many people I can perceive are standing up holding a candle against the darkness. Need I remind you that Jesus says we are more than a candle. We are the light of the world. We are the light of the world. Before these recent days, I had no idea on earth who Kayla Mueller was. But her name kept popping up on my web browser this week as I was checking the news, and so I tried to find out who Kayla Mueller is. You may know she has been held hostage by the jihadists in Syria since August 2013. She went to Syria because she was possessed by a passion to go and do something about the suffering there. That somehow she could be a different presence, a different word in the midst of all the violence and the suffering and the bloodshed in Syria. When she finally got there, all of the relief organizations were astounded by her energy, by her passion, by what she wanted to do to alleviate in any way she could the suffering that she encountered on a daily basis. The last couple of days, as you may know, we have learned that ISIS has scruples about beheading or burning women. So they have not taken Kayla's life themselves, but instead they apparently placed her in a building where those retaliating against their advance would kill her through a bombing attack. As of today, I don't think anyone knows whether Kayla Mueller is alive or dead. Now, early this morning, as I was praying, I began to think of Kayla. And I began to realize something about her and something that she understands that I apparently have not yet grasped. And that when you follow Jesus and you accept the call of discipleship, there are still crosses out there. There are still powers and principalities that will nail you to a tree and take your life for being passionate about being messengers of mercy and kindness and gentleness and love in our world. Before she was taken hostage, Kayla was asked, "What in the world are you doing in Syria?" by a British journalist. And this is how she responded: "I find God in the suffering eyes reflected in mine. If this is how you are revealed to me, this is how I will seek you forever." If this is how you, God, reveal yourself to me, I will be seeking you here forever. Seems to me that Kayla had a good ear to hear Isaiah's voice. And despite what the world might look like to us sitting in our homes in Paducah, she saw something else. She saw suffering and yes, death and yes, violence and yes, atrocities, but nothing could keep her from being there as light. Now, as Jesus often does, He will not let me be content with just recognizing what Kayla has done. But He makes me ask and wonder, why do I spend so much time sitting around on my can? What happens to me in Paducah where there is no violence, no real animosity or hatred among our citizens, if I step out and take a chance on justice, on speaking truth, on alleviating suffering, of carrying the broken, of weeping with the sorrowful, of standing up to wrong and oppression and abuse? Sadly, these are the only things I can think of. I might upset some of you for a time. I might get my feelings hurt. I might no longer be asked to go to some places where I'm welcome now. But really, that's not much of a cross to die on, is it? Not hardly the cross I think Jesus had in mind when He said, "Take up your cross and follow me." If we become disillusioned and despairing and dark and cynical, let us today hear Isaiah and let us wait on the Lord. Let us receive our hope from Him And let us trust that in the days ahead, the world may not change, but Yahweh Himself will give us power to soar like eagles, to run and not grow weary. And when we think we can do nothing else, we may think we will faint, but we will not. We will continue to walk. For Yahweh, the Lord of heaven and earth and all of humanity, is with us. Amen. I invite you this morning to listen to Isaiah, to listen to what you have heard, to listen to the voice of Jesus speaking to you, that you may be responsive to Him in whatever He may say to you and wherever He may lead you, as we stand together to sing 646, the hymn, Teach Me Your Way.